Hello and welcome to My Baseball History, presented by the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum and Baseball Library in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm your host, Dan Wallach, and I'm the Executive Director of the museum. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. On today's episode, I spoke with Marjorie Adams. Marjorie is the great-granddaughter of Daniel Lucius Adams, more commonly known as Doc Adams. Doc was born in Mount Vernon, New Hampshire on November 1st, 1814. He graduated from Yale in 1835 and then from Harvard Medical School in 1838. The following year, he became a vaccine physician for the city of New York for $400 a year and volunteered as an attending physician to the New York Dispensary for the Poor. He eventually set up his own medical practice in New York City. Later in life, Doc became one of the founding members of the Ridgefield Library in Ridgefield, Connecticut, as well as its first treasurer. He was active with the Land Improvement Association, and in 1870 he even served one term in the Connecticut State Legislature. In 1871, he became the first president of the Ridgefield Savings Bank and would serve as the president for 10 of the next 15 years. So why are we talking to this guy's great-granddaughter? Because in 1839, Doc started playing baseball with the New York Baseball Club. By 1845, he was with the Knickerbocker Baseball Club, where he would eventually be named vice president, then president and captain. Doc was playing for the Knickerbockers in what was once recognized as the first organized recorded baseball game on June 19, 1846 at Elysian Fields in Hoboken, New Jersey. In 1849, he developed and created the shortstop position. He invented the position. And in 1857, he was in charge of writing the laws of baseball, the first ever document unifying all of the clubs under the same set of rules. Doc Adams' fingerprints are all over the history of baseball and the creation and growth of the game as we know it today. Unfortunately, far fewer people know his name than should. Doc doesn't appear on a plaque in the Baseball Hall of Fame, even though without him, there's a decent chance that there would be no such sport to celebrate and remember inside that building at all. In 2014, the Society for American Baseball Research elected Doc their overlooked 19th century baseball legend, and the following year, Doc appeared on the Hall of Fame ballot for the very first time. He received more votes than any other candidate up for election through the pre-integration era committee, but fell 2 votes shy of the 75% needed for election. And that leads us to our guest today, Doc's great-granddaughter, Marjorie Adams. It has been Marjorie's mission to educate the baseball world and the public in general about Doc so that he may one day take his rightful place in Cooperstown. She has been working tirelessly to raise awareness of his story and his role in the game for the last decade, and was even profiled in the New York Times prior to the last time Doc was eligible for the Hall of Fame. But Marjorie lives in New England, and I'm in South Carolina by way of Chicago, so how did we meet? You know how at the end of every episode I tell you guys, if there's anyone you think I should get in touch with to interview for a future episode, let me know. Well, in August of 2020, one of our listeners did just that. Sam Rubin sent an email saying Marjorie would be a great person to reach out to, and boy was he right. My interview with Marjorie was like no other interview I had done before for this podcast. Not only did we invite Sam to sit in as a thank you for setting the whole thing up, but I also brought my mom with me, who sat in to observe too. It was part of a short 3-day weekend road trip to Philadelphia, Boston, Connecticut, and Baltimore that my mom and I executed in October, which was basically the only time either of us left the house other than for groceries since March. It was a perfect little trip, which you'll hear more about in future episodes because it actually resulted in 3 new interviews for this season of My Baseball History. 2 episodes that will air in 2021, and this one with Marjorie. In this episode, we cover lots of ground. Marjorie tells us how Doc's background in mathematics helped shape baseball in its early years. We find out that you can piece together a lot about somebody's past if their family kept a bunch of handwritten letters. We learn the lengths Doc had to go to have his team ready for games. And we hear how Doc gave up his hobby and moved away from all of his friends to pursue his true passion. With all of that information and much, much more coming at you, it may be helpful to follow along with the episode's liner notes on our website. You'll still be able to enjoy the interview without the extra help, but sometimes when I'm listening to things like this, I like to really go in depth, so I've provided some photos and links to give you a better understanding of the things Marjorie and I are discussing. Those liner notes can be found at the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum website, which is online at www.shoelessjoejackson.org. If you want to follow along, head over to the museum's website and click on the podcast tab at the top. You can also head straight to shoelessjoejackson.org/shoelesspodcast, and it will take you right to the page, where you can click on the Marjorie Adams episode or any past episode you might want to catch up on. Everything in the liner notes goes in chronological order of how we talked about them in the interview, so you should easily be able to keep your place as you listen. At the end of the episode, I'll explain how you can answer a trivia question on Twitter to win some prizes, so stick around until the end of the episode for that. The winner of our last episode's trivia contest was Kobe Paget, who's on Twitter at KobePinSC. After listening to the Lester Irwin episode of My Baseball History, Kobe knew that Shoeless Joe Jackson's famous bat, Black Betsy, was made of hickory. Kobe, shoot me a DM on Twitter at Shoeless Podcast with your mailing address, and I'll send you your prizes. But now, here's my interview with Marjorie Adams.
I was born and raised in New York City. My mother's side of the family goes back to the Dutch in New Amsterdam. My father was from Buffalo, New York. And I lived in New York pretty much until about 1988 when I moved up to New England. A move that was wonderful at the time. And, there've been some moments that I thought, gee, I'd love to go back to New York, but no, not now. I'm very happy up here in New England.
It's beautiful up here.
Isn't it pretty?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're here at the best time of year before the leaves have really started to change.
Right.
Because then we get into 6 months of gray and cold and gray and gold and gray and gold, and we won't see the sun again until April if we're lucky.
Right, yeah. We're originally from Chicago, so
you know.
Sometimes we're lucky if it's only 6 months of gray and cold.
Yeah, yeah, so you know.
So growing up, were you into sports at all?
No, not at all. I am the least athletic person who has ever sat in front of this microphone with you, Dan. Nobody is less athletic than I am. I've never had any interest or any aptitude. Mm-hmm. So therefore, it's just, no. I have other things that I'm interested in.
And what are some of those things?
I love American history.
Do you have a specialty?
No, I'll just learn anything about American history I can possibly get my hands on. I'll read almost anything. Mm-hmm. Let's see. I love Broadway theater. Grew up with the genre. I love Gilbert and Sullivan, but of course that's where Broadway musicals came from. Mm-hmm. So I just grew up with that sort of music, and cool. I love it to this day. Beyond that, I just, as Shakespeare said, living life in its petty pace from day to day.
So you are the great-granddaughter of Daniel Lucius Adams, who was born November 1st, 1814.
Yes.
Which hardly seems possible, but Doc was 60 when his youngest son was born, and that was your grandfather, right?
Yes, that is correct.
So Doc's father, Daniel Adams, was also a pretty impressive man.
Yes,
Tell me a little bit about him.
In some ways, Doc's father is more interesting than he is. He is certainly accomplished. He was a doctor. He was also head of a boys' school in Boston for a while. Early in the 1800s, he published one of the first agricultural newspapers. He wrote arithmetic and geography textbooks. The family was always amused by the geography textbooks written by a man who was never west of Buffalo, New York in his entire life. But he managed to write geography textbooks about places all around the world, and his Adams Arithmetic was widely published and was in publication well into the 1860s. In fact, in the 1850s, in the late 1850s, I have a lot of letters written by Doc's father to Doc, who was then in New York. Doc was helping his father with the reprint of the book and editing the book. And there's, if anyone is really a mathematician, I'll be happy to send them a copy of a letter from Doc's father to Doc. And, well, here is the problem on page such and such, and is the answer correct? Well, the problem goes on for 2 pages. So anyone who can understand the problem, I give them credit because they're way ahead of me.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So that letter's not very interesting for a non-mathematical person.
But again, just a historical document that tells the story.
Tells the story.
And shows their relationship.
Absolutely. And we have about 150 letters written to Doc by his father.
Right.
None of them mention baseball, and I have my theories on that.
Yeah, we will get to that, okay. I promise. So for years, Doc Adams was kind of lost to the sands of time, but in 1980, a letter about him appeared in the New York Times, and by 1993, researcher John Thorne had written about his role in the creation of baseball. Other historians have given him credit for helping to develop the sport, and Thorne has called Adams, quote, first among the fathers of baseball. So at what point did you learn about Doc's connection to the game, and was it something that you always knew growing up and something you talked about, or was this all kind of news to your family until researchers started uncovering things?
We knew about Doc. My parents made sure that we knew family stories on both sides of the family. It was common topic of conversation at the dinner table. So yes, I knew about Doc. I knew just the basics, and I knew he'd played baseball and for the Knickerbockers in New York. I couldn't have told you what year. I mean, I didn't know any of that. And I'm sure I knew it, but had forgotten.
Right.
So it really wasn't until about 2011, when I read John Thorne's book, Baseball in the Garden of Eden, that I really learned about Doc's baseball career. I really didn't know any of that at all, and I've had to play a lot of catch-up, and I have learned more about Doc in that first year than I certainly knew going in.
And what were some of the things that were going through your mind when you're reading these things? Like, how come I never knew this, or how do these people find these things out when I couldn't? Or
Well, I have great respect for those who do historical research. It always amazes me that they find some obscure newspaper article from some publication in Detroit, Michigan in 1862 that has 2 lines about baseball. How did they find it?
Right.
I mean, I can barely find my cell phone. So, I mean, I have great respect for historical researchers. And I am very grateful for what they do.
Yeah, absolutely. You've said that Doc never really talked about baseball, and the same is true for Abner Doubleday. At the time of his death, Doubleday left many letters and papers, but none of them describe baseball or give any suggestion that he considered himself a prominent person in the evolution of the game. His New York Times obituary didn't mention baseball at all, and another obituary actually actively noted that he had displayed no real interest in outdoor sports during his life. So you've got your own theories about why Doc Adams didn't really talk about baseball, but I'm guessing that they're a little different than the reason why Doubleday never did.
Yes, they're a little different. You'd have to understand the family. This is an old Puritan family, very tight-lipped Yankees, and self-promotion and boasting is forbidden. It would just be the worst thing you could possibly do in a family setting, is to start boasting about yourself. You'd be driven from the house. So that's part of it. The other part of it is when Doc retired from baseball in 1862, he was 48 years old. He'd gotten married the year before for the first time. His wife, my great-grandmother Cornelia, was 33. By March of 1862, she was pregnant with their first child. And I think that was Doc's wake-up call, that his priority was to be a husband and a father. Sadly, she would lose that baby about 2 months later, and it almost killed her.
Right.
She didn't really come out of it till September of that year. But I think that was the catalyst. In 1888, he had to write a short biography for a Yale alumni publication. He makes no mention of baseball in it. But he does say, and I'm going to quote it, "My marriage was the crowning achievement of my life." So that tells you what you need to know about the man.
Right. Just to catch everybody up who might not already know, so the Doubleday myth claims that in 1839, Abner Doubleday played in the first ever baseball game in Cooperstown, New York, and that he created the sport by modifying town ball. That's the reason why the Hall of Fame is in Cooperstown, and the reason why the field there is named Doubleday Field. Baseball really bought into this creation myth and put all their eggs in that basket, but your family has a letter which you call the Bat and Ball letter, and that's dated June 15th, 1832, so 7 years earlier, well before the supposed first game of baseball, according to the Doubleday myth. Tell me a little bit about the Bat and Ball letter and where Doc was when he got that.
Doc was at Yale when he received this letter from his father with all the usual admonitions of you're not studying hard enough and don't spend any money. Every single letter has that in it. But there was also a postscript written by Doc's younger sister, Nancy. She was 11 years old. In it she writes, and again I'm going to quote, "I have not played with your bat and ball as you bid me. I forget it every day, and indeed I have not seen it since you went away," unquote. I think the father took it away from her. There are a lot of references of her being rather sickly.
Oh.
I also think she stammered badly, which is a whole other tangent of conversation, which I've just gathered from reading between the lines in these letters.
Yeah.
And I also thought the father thought that his daughter should apply herself to her studies more than running around playing any bat and ball game. Now, the bat and ball game that he might have been playing then, would have been playing then, I don't know if they called it baseball. They probably didn't. It could have been wicket, which was a popular form of a bat and ball game in Connecticut, at least. There was one cat, two cat, all sorts of cats. I don't know what that was about. So we don't know, and it's not fair to call it baseball. It is fair to say it just is a testament to his interest in sports that he became interested in while he was in college.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to give a little bit more history about bat and ball sports existing well before 1839, there was also an ordinance from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, which was uncovered in the year 2004 that banned, quote, baseball from being played within 80 yards of a meeting house in the city. That letter was dated in the year 1791, which implies that the game, or at least some form of it, already existed at that time, again, well before 1839, as the Doubleday myth would have us believe. The theory that activities such as the English game of rounders led to modern baseball is pretty common among modern historians, but older bat and ball games have been cited as well. No matter how baseball actually did first take shape, it seems pretty evident through decades of research that Doubleday was not its creator.
None. None whatsoever.
Yeah.
I mean, Doubleday had about as much to do with the invention or promotion of baseball as I do with nuclear physics. So there you go.
The Doubleday timeline also doesn't even really make sense because the first game was supposed to take place in 1839, and at that time, Doubleday was in West Point, New York, at the United States Military Academy, and it's extremely unlikely that he would have been allowed to travel to Cooperstown in 1839 as a first-year cadet because they were rarely given leave at that time. However, it was in 1839, shortly after Doc Adams moved to New York, when he started to, quote, play baseball just for exercise with a number of other young medical men, unquote, which he told the Sporting News in an 1896 interview. But let's back up and talk about how he wound up in New York in the first place. We know he was in Amherst in 1832, like you mentioned, but he wasn't happy there, even though he was friends with Henry Ward Beecher and played flute duets with him.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And I have tried to find out if they continued that friendship when Henry Ward Beecher was the minister of the Plymouth Congregational Church in Brooklyn, New York in the 1850s. Henry Ward Beecher, of course, was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And Doc's father was an early abolitionist. Doc's father was also very keen on the temperance movement, and he would orate at the drop of a hat on either of those subjects. So Doc came from this background of being pro-abolition and part of the temperance movement. So I don't know if Doc and Henry Ward Beecher got together and did the flute duets in New York as well. We know they did them at Amherst.
Right.
I have contacted Henry Ward Beecher's biographer, who wrote a wonderful book on him. Deborah Applegate was her name, wrote a great, interesting biography on Henry Ward Beecher. And she said she had never come across the name in her research. I was wondering if an appointment book or a diary or something might have referenced it.
Yeah.
So yes, he did. He loved music. And there was another member of the Knickerbockers, Walter Avery, who was a distant cousin of Doc's wife, my great-grandmother. And I have a letter from my grandfather saying that they were visiting Walter Avery, and father and Uncle Walter are going into the den to play some flutes. So we also played flute duets with other people as well.
So he transferred to Yale, where he graduated in 1835, and then after Yale, he went on to Harvard Medical School, where he graduated in 1838. Then he went on to study and practice medicine with his father in Mount Vernon, New Hampshire. But by 1839, we know he was already living in New York City.
The business about practicing medicine with his father, I'm not sure it really was actually practice. He was practicing is really what it comes down to, because as I understand it, at Harvard Medical School at the time, part of the graduation requirement was studying with some doctor for X number of months prior to graduation. So I think he was fulfilling a graduation requirement.
Gotcha.
Because he got his actual degree from Harvard late in the summer of 1838. Oddly enough, his thesis was on diseases of the eye. Yet there's never any reference to that ever again in any of the family letters, only that he also treated stammerers.
Interesting.
That comes up several times in family letters. Nothing about treating patients with eye disease. So,
Yeah, that's...
who knows?
again, one of the things about history is that sometimes you only see one reference, and that might be the thread that you need to pull on to unravel a new story that you've never heard before or seen before. So yeah, that'd be interesting to know whatever happened with that. Why did it stop, or did it stop? Yeah, that's interesting. In 1845, Doc was offered a job which would have forced him to move out of New York, but he decided to stay, much to the delight of his father.
Yes, we have a letter dated March of 1845, about 7 months before Doc joined the Knickerbockers. And we don't have the letters leading up to it. Mm-hmm. But this letter clearly says, I'm glad you're not going to take this position in Springfield. Stay in New York and cure all stammerers that come. That's a direct quote from the letter. So it's useless but kind of fun to speculate what might have happened to baseball if Doc had moved to Springfield. Would have he gotten involved in town ball, which was so popular up in Massachusetts? What would have happened to baseball in New York? It's fascinating. It's a fun what if and just a complete waste of time. but still, it's a lot of fun to think about.
Yeah. Later that year, in 1845, Doc started playing with the Knickerbocker Baseball Club, which was an established club that had been playing already for a few years. They formally organized on September 23rd, 1845, and Doc joined about a month later. When they were founded, they wrote down 17 rules of play, 7 of which dictated how the club members were to behave. Was Doc involved in the writing of those rules, or did he join after that had already happened?
He joined after that, after that. And I think those rules, they were rules that they had been playing by already. It was just this Victorian penchant for organization and science that they'd wanted, and it was a formal club now, which I think is so sweet. Doc's first recorded game with the club was November 18th in 1845, and he made quite a few runs. He did very well in that game. Oh, yes, here it is. He made 9 runs.
Wow.
And side A beat side B 51-42. Wouldn't you if you wanted to watch that game? A 51-42 game.
Yeah. We were just talking in the car on the way up here that throughout the history and the formation of the sport, it's gone through so many different iterations that sometimes you'd play a game to 100 before somebody wins. And those games might take days, like cricket. Or sometimes, they would play to 21 runs. Or it wasn't, we'll get to this later on, but it wasn't until Doc wrote the laws of baseball that a game was capped at 9 innings.
Yes.
But yeah, it's interesting to go back and read. Somebody scored 9 runs in a game. It's like, yeah, that game might have taken place over...
Might have been 4 days.
Right, yeah.
And a lot of them ended because it got dark.
Right.
So if you look through the score sheets of Knickerbocker club games, a lot of them only went to 7 innings because of dark. They don't say because of the dark, because of dark.
Some of the rules among the original 17 were that the ball was to be fed to the batter with an underhand pitch, that fielders did not wear gloves, that no one wore cleats, and that uniforms weren't worn. They also set some distances, although there was room for error, because they wrote that there should be 15 paces from pitcher's base to home, and that there should be 42 paces between the bases. But if one person had longer strides than someone else, or the person making those paces wasn't consistent with the length of their strides, that could impact the game.
Yes.
Where did the Knickerbockers play those games?
They started out playing in any vacant field they could find in New York City. They used to play at Madison Square Park, which still exists today, although it's much smaller than it was in the mid-1800s. There was also an open field about 2 blocks east of Madison Square Park that they played in. And when the Harlem Railroad was expanding outside of New York City, they were going to come right through this field, so the Knickerbockers got kicked out of there. And then in 1845, they got kicked out of Madison Square Park because the city was growing up around them, and people didn't want these baseballs flying around. There was a third spot up in Harlem called the Red House, which was about 105th, 2nd Avenue in that area.
Okay.
It was a huge sporting area. It had a harness race track. There was a field for cricket. They had a park. People would go up there on hot weekends and walk around in the shade. There was a trolley that they would take up. And I was reading an account last night in Tom Gilbert's new book, How Baseball Happened, about the players getting off at 86th Street and what is now Park Avenue. Well, that's the neighborhood I grew up in.
Wow.
And it just sort of I'm reading this last night, and it just sort of, wow, Doc was walking around in my old neighborhood on the way up to Harlem. I mean, that's just fantastic.
Yeah.
That was kind of exciting.
Those moments seem so silly to get excited about, but it's like it gives you that connection to history, and you think like, wow, I was there and I didn't even know the
Yeah.
history of this place. And I think that's what people like you are so important for, that you bridge that gap and you tell people this is what happened 150 years ago, and it's important that you're aware of it. Do you consider yourself a steward of history, as somebody who is helping to tell the truth and get baseball's origin story out there?
Yes, I want to get Doc's story out there. I want to educate people so that automatically when they hear the name Doc Adams, they don't think of Gunsmoke first.
Mm-hmm.
They think of Gunsmoke second.
You still
That's
want
all
them to
I
think
have
of
to-
Gunsmoke, just
That's
not first.
okay. Gunsmoke was a very fine television program. It didn't last as long as Doc did playing baseball, but I don't think. I'd have to check that with Wikipedia. But back in January, somebody messaged me on Facebook and said that someone had mentioned Doc Adams on a call-in radio show in Boston just within the hour. I don't listen to sports radio. I have a life to live. But I found it on their website. I got all internet savvy that day. I found it on their website. It was terribly exciting. And I listened to the rebroadcast. And they were talking about the Hall of Fame nominations that had just come out. And so I listened to it, and someone called in, and his name was Nick, I think, from Attleboro, he said. I've never found Nick from Attleboro. And he said, I wanted to ask you if you think that Doc Adams might get in the Hall of Fame this year. Oh, God love Nick from Attleboro, whoever you are, you're my hero. And he said, Doc Adams, ha, ha, ha. Is that when he's playing Gunsmoke? He made some comment like that and hung up on the guy. I sent him an email and I wrote him. Never heard back, of course. I never do. There are lots of people I write to and say, hey, wrong, 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 wrong.
I think that's important, though, because we run into that same thing at the museum with people who are dead set that certain things happen because I saw it in the movie 8 Men Out.
Yes.
It's like, yeah, but that's not true. It's not what happened. And
Yes.
32 years later, we have better information and more facts and things have been uncovered. So
Yep.
it's our job to educate those people about, okay, yeah, that is what we thought back then, but today we know that that's not correct.
Yes.
And I think there's a way to do that without making people feel like they're inferior or make them feel like they're stupid because they just didn't keep up with all the cutting edge information that's come out.
And my letter was really very, as my mother would have said, sweet, simple, and girlish.
Yeah.
Boy, was that contrary to my personality. So anyway, it was a very nice letter, and I said,
yeah.
I just wanted to let you know this is who Doc Adams really is.
Right.
And that's all right. I would just keep hammering away.
Right.
You know, it's like throwing those dirty socks up at the ceiling. Some of them got to stick sometime.
Right. Yeah.
And
you just,
someday they will.
and you hope that the people that you reach out to take it to heart and say like, okay, maybe I wasn't quite informed enough, or this is new information that I'd never heard of, and then they can take that as a jumping point. Or
And you never know. Maybe he'd be a voter next year.
you never know. That's the attitude I have with so many people. You always say yes because you never know. They might not help you today,
Yeah.
but maybe 5 years down the road, or they can
Or
put you in
one
touch with
person
somebody.
will hear this who knows one person.
Right.
And that's fine. I mean, I know I'm not reaching 10 million people. Wouldn't it be great if we were, Dan?
Yes, it would be.
But if I reach one person who says, wow, I know so-and-so, I mean, or maybe someone who writes for a newspaper, and the next time they hear the name Doc Adams, they'll go, gee, I heard that podcast and website and docadamsbaseball.org. I'm shameless, aren't I?
No,
I'm absolutely shameless.
That's what you got to do.
That's what you got to do.
Yeah. So on May 5th, 1846, Doc was elected vice president
yes.
of the Knickerbocker Baseball Club. How was he able to rise so quickly among the ranks when he had just joined a little over 6 months prior?
I think to get into the Knickerbockers was more by invitation. They were an interesting bunch of gentlemen. And so I think he had at least a good reputation prior to that. And he'd made 9 runs in their game in November, so they knew he knew how to play. Beyond that, I can't tell you.
Yeah.
But he obviously made an impression
Right, absolutely.
that in the first year he's elected vice president.
Yeah, and on June 19th, 1846, Doc played in the Knickerbocker Baseball Club's first official game at
Yes.
Allegiant Fields in Hoboken, New Jersey. For a long time, people thought that that was the first place where a baseball game ever happened. We know now that that's not true, but what do we know about that game and that site?
Well, we know that the Knickerbockers took a drubbing, and their score was 23-1 against the New York Baseball Club that Doc had been a member of, as had other new Knickerbocker members. We also know that in that game, Doc made no runs and 3 outs. We also know that someone named Davis on the opposing team was charged 3 cents for swearing because this was a gentleman's game.
Right.
And that's one of the things I like about vintage baseball. Those are rules they still adhere to.
Yeah.
Swearing is not allowed.
Or spitting or sliding. Yeah, there's a lot of...
Well, sliding was against the rules.
Right.
And that was ungentlemanly. That was unsportsmanlike.
Right.
You certainly can't slide into first base. That is against the rules.
Yeah.
And somebody really swore at a vintage game last year. Everybody was just horrified. Not in an old lady fuddy-duddy way, but this is all meant to be family friendly, and you sit very close to the game when you're at a vintage game.
Yeah.
You aren't 200 yards away in the stand where you won't hear it. And everybody was really unhappy, and the guy apologized profusely, and everybody was friends again because they just don't allow it.
Right. It's a very different atmosphere at the vintage games. It is supposed to be just everybody getting together and having a good time and gentlemanly or ladylike, whoever is playing.
And friendly competition.
Right. We mentioned earlier that the ball is supposed to be fed to the batter. You're not trying to strike people out. You're giving them an opportunity to hit it. Yep. So it's just a completely different way of thinking compared to what baseball has become.
Absolutely. Now, I was on the phone with this man yesterday who plays vintage baseball out in Michigan. He said sometimes their games out there get a little cutthroat.
Really?
But in New England, it's not played that way here.
Yeah, interesting. After they played that game, the Knickerbocker Baseball Club did not play another game against another club for 5 years.
5 years, 1851.
Why was it so hard for the team to find competition during that time?
You know, a lot of people speculate on that because the New York Baseball Club, their ranks were sort of decimated because so many members went to the Knickerbockers. So it might have been a matter of getting enough men together to play, or the Knickerbockers weren't good enough, or too snooty. I mean, I'm not sure what to pick or if it's a combination of things.
There's a quote, "Our players were not so enthusiastic at first. During these first 5 years, baseball had a desperate struggle for existence, the pursuit of pleasure under difficulties."
Yes, that's a quote from Doc.
Right.
From the Sporting News interview of 1896.
Right.
Absolutely. And I met a man back in 1997, John Hussman. His vintage club was the Black Swamp Frogs of Sylvania, Ohio.
Amazing name.
Amazing name. I just love it. And at that same, where I met John Hussman, this was at a vintage game in Wallingford, Connecticut, which is another long story. I met a charming man, Fred Ivor Campbell. He has passed away now, sadly. He was a wonderful baseball researcher. And this was when I knew none of all this baseball detail about Doc. And I was talking to Fred Ivor Campbell, and he's telling me about Doc. And all of a sudden he says, well, you know, Doc saved baseball. I'm thinking, these people, they're cuckoo. They're very nice people, but they're, I don't know. And he said, well, yes, because Doc was the one who got the players out to the field. He was the one, as president of the club, who had to encourage them.
Right.
And get them out there to play. I hadn't seen that Sporting News interview. It was another 22 years before I saw the Sporting News interview.
Right, yeah.
So I didn't know about that quote. But the two sort of dovetail. That Doc does get some credit as president of the club. It was up to him to get the players out there.
Yeah, I've read that as president of the club, it's up to him to drive attendance, and that didn't mean getting people to come watch you play. It meant literally having your players attend the games that they're supposed to play in.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, it took some effort either to haul the way all up to Red House Tavern in Harlem on a slow horse cart, or to take the ferry over from Barclay Street on Manhattan to go over to Hoboken.
Yeah. So in 1846, Doc was elected vice president. In 1847, he was elected captain or president of the club, a position that he would hold 6 more times over the next 17 years. Other than driving attendance, what were some of his duties as president?
Well, he made all the balls for the club. A Scottish saddler in Lower Manhattan had shown him how to wrap the yarn around a nut or a pebble or something. Wrap the yarn, and then Doc would cut up his friend's old rubber galoshes for rubber strips, and then the saddler showed him how to cut and sew the leather. So Doc made all the balls for the club, because there were no commercial ventures in New York making them.
Right.
Doc supervised all the manufacture of the bats.
And that was between the years 1846 and 1861. He was in charge of making the baseballs and overseeing the production of the bats.
Yes. Now, by the mid-50s, there was somebody who was making commercial baseballs. I know because I've seen the receipts from the New York Public Library. He was still making balls for the club in 1861.
Uh-huh.
Now, maybe they were also buying baseballs as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a recording of my grandfather talking about Doc, and well into his 70s, Doc was making baseballs for his son's backyard play in Ridgefield, Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, wouldn't I like one of those.
I don't think it's overstating the importance of that effort, though, that without Doc going to that trouble, there's a chance that baseball never catches on, because if the equipment isn't readily available and people can't play the game, it gets forgotten about. Did he see it that way? Did other people see it that way?
No, Doc didn't see it that way. I don't think anybody saw it that way. And I also think that there were other clubs playing some sorts of bat and ball games in New York and in Brooklyn at the time. They were separate cities, of course. So there were other people playing baseball at this time, and what they did for equipment, I have no idea. I think one of the things was that the Knickerbockers kept a record of everything. Their meetings, their scores, the debates, the conversations, where they had dinner, who was behind on their dues. They left all these records. And I think some of that credit, not all, but I think some of that credit can go to Doc, who was a physician, who would have had to record everything.
Yeah.
and as I said earlier, there was that Victorian penchant for detail and leaving a record. Other clubs and their records may show up someday, which would be great, because I'd love to know what these other clubs were doing. I mean, really know more than we do know.
Yeah.
But the Knickerbockers wrote everything down, and we still have those records.
Yeah.
And I think that is at least a contributing factor as to why they are remembered.
Definitely.
And why Doc is remembered as president of the club in the early years when the whole thing could have folded anyway. From lack of interest, from their own members.
Right. So it's 1848. It had been 2 years since the club had played a game against another team, but they were playing against themselves so often that there were on-field disagreements about their own laws and rules. So what did they do?
To cut down on the arguments, they formed a committee, of course. One always forms a committee, to discuss the rules and to come up with new rules for the Knickerbockers, which is exactly what they did. It was a 3-man committee, and then, of course, I guess the club had to approve them. And Doc was in charge of the committee, but they revised their 1845 rules. Again, that Victorian detail, precision, recording. I love it.
Yeah.
Just love it.
One of the main innovations of the Knickerbocker Baseball Club when they formally organized in 1845 was that they no longer allowed plugging or soaking a runner. What did that mean, and what was their reasoning?
That meant that you could not aim a ball at a player to strike him out. It's dangerous. For a grown man to hit a running grown man with a ball, you can really injure somebody.
Right.
When it's a small child, that's very different. Their strength isn't the same. I don't think it's any good. You don't help anybody by doing it.
Right.
But you don't have the same risks as you do with an adult.
Right.
And I also think that maybe there was that gentlemanly aspect to it as well. It's not cricket, as the British would say. It's not baseball.
Yeah.
Or shouldn't be.
Well, that's interesting to me, though, because one of the things that Doc always advocated for was called the fly game, which meant that a batter would no longer be out if the fielder caught a ball on the bounce, that they must catch it on a fly for the batter to be out. Doc thought that the game would be more manly if they used exclusively the fly game, and one of the reasons why there was so much opposition to that rule in particular was because there were so many young clubs and inexperienced players that they didn't all really know how to catch the ball properly. And since there were no gloves being used by fielders at the time, there was also a much greater risk of hand and finger injuries. So to me, it's interesting that Doc was in favor of that rule change while removing the ability to soak a runner because that was too dangerous. How did he juggle that in his mind?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Let me ask him someday. As soon as I shuffle off this mortal coil, I will ask him. Because you're right, it's a good point. It's a very good point.
His quote was that in every meeting of the National Association while I was a member, I advocated the fly game, but I was always defeated on the vote. The change was made, however, soon after I left, as I predicted in my last speech on the subject before the convention. So they did eventually adopt that rule, and obviously that's how baseball is played today.
Yeah, in 1864, and the first playing season was 1865. Yes.
Throughout the course of his career, Doc Adams played every position for the Knickerbockers except for pitcher, or hurler as it was known back then. But in 1849, Doc developed and created the shortstop position, which would become his favorite position to play. Why and how did that come about?
Well, the balls that Doc made were very light. So you could bat them quite a distance, but you couldn't throw them very far. And so he saw the need for a relay position between way outfield and the infielder.
Mm-hmm.
So it became an intermediary position. It didn't move into where it is now till much later.
Mm-hmm.
So it became an intermediate position to relay into the infield.
Yeah.
So it became a very important position.
Right.
And even today, I think there are those who would say it's probably the most important field position.
Yeah, absolutely.
It really is.
He said, quote, "I used to play shortstop, and I believe I was the first to occupy that place,
Yes.
as it had formerly been left uncovered."
Yes.
The
How modest.
Well, but the fact that he saw the need for that position and was like, you know what, I'm just going to go stand over there now, and
Yeah.
that's going to make everybody easier.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
do you know there were experiments in the 1880s? Henry Chadwick proposed it for a shortstop in right field.
Interesting.
Well, but most batters are right-handed, so of course it's going to go to where the shortstop is now.
Right.
But for the left-handed batters like Doc, because
Yeah.
Doc batted left, it would go to the right.
Uh-huh.
And I know they experimented with both, a right and a left shortstop. I don't know the whole history of that,
Yeah.
but I remember reading that once. I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, that's cool. By 1851, there were two other clubs that the Knickerbockers were playing against, the Gothams and the Eagles. What do we know about those clubs?
The Gothams was originally the Washingtons, which had been the New York Baseball Club.
Okay.
They changed their names. And so the New York Baseball Club was now the Gothams, and they played them, and then the Eagles. So the Gothams and the Eagles were their favorite clubs to play. And they played those clubs pretty much exclusively for about 3-4 years.
Yeah.
In fact, there were some clubs they never played. They never played the Atlantics or the Eckfords, which came along later. But those snooty old Knickerbockers, they really were in some ways a bunch of stick in the muds. and I'd really love to know more about what they were thinking.
Yeah.
Because it just frustrates me.
Yeah.
To know why they didn't play these other clubs. They must have known they existed.
You
They
would think.
certainly had ways of getting a runner or a carrier pigeon or something to them to say, hey, would you like to play? And why didn't they?
Yeah.
And these are questions I'd love to have answered.
Maybe back then just the cell service wasn't as good and the texts weren't going through.
Yeah, there you go. I think some of these clubs were formed from, how will I say this, the lower classes. And the Knickerbockers were middle to upper class.
Gotcha.
They weren't aristocracy, but they were middle and middle upper class gentlemen for the most part. And these other clubs, like the Eckfords and the Atlantic, were founded a little bit more by the working class. So it might have been those snooty Knickerbockers again.
Yeah, maybe.
I have nothing to back that up. I'm just working some logic.
Yeah, and that's an interesting theory, though. By 1854, these three clubs were playing lots of games against each other, but they each had their own unique sets of rules. So how was that situation resolved?
Well, the same way, there was a meeting in 1854 of the three clubs, and Doc was one of the delegates. So they could all sit down and agree to their rules of play, and Doc was part of that as well. There was another meeting in early 1856 that was called, but for some reason the Knickerbockers didn't show, so they canceled the meeting. Why the Knickerbockers didn't show, I have no idea.
Yeah, interesting.
So much we don't know yet.
But the three clubs that had that convention together, was it a situation where when you're playing on our field, these are the rules we play by, and when we play at your field, we'll play by your... Is that what was going on?
And just right in the middle of a play, there'd be an argument. Well, we do it this way. No, we do it this way. That's no fun.
Right.
And they were in this for fun and exercise. So this was their attempt that when they played together, they would all play by the same rules.
Yeah.
Now, some of these clubs played by their own rules when they were just playing each other.
Right.
And then would switch to the agreed upon rules. That went on, I think, for a long time.
Yeah, probably.
For a long time. Especially with the bound game. I think there were some clubs that were playing fly game just amongst themselves, and then it would be bound and fly game when they had to play somebody else.
I'll bet that made for some interesting game situations where people
Oh,
forget
boy.
what
Yeah.
game you're supposed to be playing.
Yeah, what are we playing by?
Right.
Well, even now, if you go and watch, and they're doing 2 or 3 vintage games, they might play 1862 for one game and 1864 for the next. Well, what are we playing?
Right.
I mean, what do I have to remember now?
Right. Yeah, over the next couple of years, the game continues to grow in New York, and by 1856, there were 14 clubs playing in Manhattan alone, with about a dozen other brand new clubs forming. So, at the Knickerbocker Club meeting in December of 1856, Doc proposed that there be a general meeting of all these baseball clubs to standardize the rules of the game. And since Doc was the president of the senior-most club in New York at the time, he was elected president of the convention, and it fell on him to write the rules. So that 4-page document was titled The Laws of Baseball, and it was written in 1857. 3 of those pages have survived all these years later, and there were also 2 other accompanying documents. John Thorne said, quote, "There is no earlier manuscript related to the history of baseball that he's aware of," and he called the articles the Sports Magna Carta. There were 35 different rules presented in that document, and many of them are still incredibly easy to translate to today's game. What were some of the big ones that stick out to you?
Well, the biggest one was Doc's contribution to it, which was Doc's calculation to set the bases at 90 feet. Up until then, it had been 42 bases, which, of course, is imprecise on the best of days. Although I think I read somewhere it calculates out to about 75 feet.
Okay.
So it was Doc set it at 90 feet. You know, that was the mathematician in Doc, the physician. And it also set the pitcher's position for the first time. It was a clear definition of the pitcher's position. It also set for the first time no gambling. No gambling by anybody who's involved with the game, and I'm sure that is of much interest to you.
But which proves that gambling was a part of the game.
It was just creeping in.
Yes.
But it was friendly wagers between spectators. They didn't, you know, and that's where it was creeping in with the players themselves.
Right.
It wasn't bookies coming to their games, I don't think. I don't think it had quite reached that level. That came just a little bit later, not much later, but 1850s, about 1858 probably, with the fashion racecourse games. So I think one of the best ones is the no gambling.
Yeah. So Rule 3 was the one that set the distance at 90 feet for bases. Legendary sports writer Red Smith once said, 90 feet between home plate and first base may be the closest man has ever come to perfection.
Absolutely.
And then Rule 5, the pitcher's position and distance from home plate was clearly defined for the first time.
Yes.
There's also many other ones that are very easily translated. Like I said, like Rule 10 is drop third strike. Rule 19, a runner has to stay within 3 feet of the base path or he's automatically out. Rule 26 was an important one, though. A game should last 9 innings unless it's tied after 9, in which case it goes to extra innings.
Yes, and that's an interesting point about these papers, which I saw.
Yeah.
I saw the laws.
Right.
Which was quite a day in my life.
Yes, we will get to it.
Okay. It was originally in Doc's handwriting, 9 innings. It's on the 4th page that is missing. But we know that's what he wrote because when William Grinnell, his teammates, copied what Doc had written, he wrote it as 9.
Perfect.
And then later on, someone crossed it out and put 7, and at the very last minute, Lewis Wheaton saved the day, like the cavalry coming over the hill, and at the very last meeting of this convention, he argued for 9 innings, and it went back in. So it started with 9 innings, and it finally ended up with 9 innings. But there was a faction at the Knickerbockers that wanted 7 innings.
Did they just love the number 9 because 90 feet for the bases, 9 innings for a game? They also...
And 9 men for the side.
Rule 27, yes, was 9 players to a team.
I have no idea.
Yeah, I wonder where that came from.
I have no idea. It's an odd number. I think that's the beauty of the odd number. It has to be an odd number. Because if it's an even number, if that score starts, you're going to go to an extra inning anyway.
Right.
So the odd number gives everybody their last chance.
Right. It was also the first time that revolving was outlawed, which was jumping from team to team. Up until this point, basically anyone who showed up was allowed to play, which encouraged ringers.
And a lot of bad feeling.
Right.
And a lot of bad feeling.
Yeah. You mentioned William Grinnell, but there were actually 2 drafts which preceded the final document presented to the convention. One was written by Doc, but the other was written by William H. Grinnell.
Yes.
He was the Knickerbockers director, and he was a Wall Street broker who was also one of the convention organizers. The final document was largely based on Doc's draft, but was transcribed by Grinnell.
Yes.
Do you think that Doc, being a doctor and a mathematician, played into this?
Absolutely, I do. Absolutely, I do. He was a math genius. He was a physician. He dealt with chemistry. I mean, he had to be good in math to be a physician and a chemist in those days. He wasn't writing a prescription.
Right.
He was probably mixing it up himself half the time.
Right.
Or telling the pharmacist what the proportion should be. So, yes, I think that's part of Doc's math genius, that he was able to do this. And it's through William Grinnell that we have those papers, through his family.
Yeah, thank God.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Major League Baseball says that the first All-Star game took place in 1933 at Comiskey Park.
Oh, that silly MLB.
They acknowledge gatherings of All-Star players to play in benefit games in 1917 for Tim Murnane and previously in 1911 for Addie Joss. But the real first All-Star series was played in 1858 between a team comprised of the best players from New York and a team comprised of the best players from Brooklyn. It was a series of 3 games, and those games were played at a site called the Fashion Racecourse. What do you know about that series?
Fashion was a very popular racehorse at the time, and it was the first time that baseball was played in an enclosed ground. It was the first time that an admission was charged, and it was for the benefit of the widows and orphans of firemen. A lot of these early players came from volunteer fire companies, so I think that's probably the reason for that particular charity. And about 10,000 people attended that first time. Right. And you figure it was about 16, 17 years between can't get anybody to show up to play. Right. So all of a sudden 10,000 people are watching.
It must have been overwhelming.
It must have been.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people speculate there was probably some gambling going on.
I would imagine a little bit.
I'm sure there was some, here a little. So Doc did not play in any of those games. He was the umpire for the third and final game. Mm-hmm. And according to most historians, he was the first umpire to call men out on non-swinging strikes at that third and final game. It was the brand new rule. It had been passed by the Rules Committee that he headed up that previous spring, or winter, I should say. And it was the first time it was used. That game was recorded on the front page of the New York Times the next day, and most people acknowledge it as the first time that a baseball game was on the front page of the New York Times.
Yeah, incredible.
And there's Doc's name right there. That's kind of fun.
Absolutely.
That's one of those fun moments.
Yeah. The earliest known photograph of the Knickerbocker Baseball Club was taken in South Brooklyn on August 2nd, 1859. Doc played in that game, so he's in that photo. Even though he was a pretty prominent person in a handful of different fields throughout his life, and despite being seemingly well off financially later on, there are very few verified photographs of Doc. Why do people so often try to claim that he's in photos that he's not actually in? What is there to gain by doing that?
I can't answer that question.
Okay.
Because I'm going to step on a lot of toes. That 1846 daguerreotype is garbage, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
I have read...
It doesn't even look like him.
Saber did an analysis, a 10-page analysis that you have to be a NASA scientist to understand. But the bottom line is, every single image in that picture, they said, that's not who it is, that's not who it is.
Right.
Including the image of Alexander Cartwright that does not look anything like about 10 other images of Alexander Cartwright. Yet that's the one the family used for that phony plaque.
Right.
Don't get me started.
So,
you want to see me go into cranky mode? Okay. So... I mean, that daguerreotype is garbage.
Yeah.
And anytime anybody uses it, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up.
Yeah.
The 1859 in South Brooklyn, yes, that's verifiable.
Right.
I got, through my website, an email back in May from somebody with this old stereopticon photograph. And he said, I just bought this picture, and I need you to verify it for me that that's Doc Adams in the front row. I cannot tell you 6 weeks of arguing with this guy. That image had nothing to do with the bridge of the nose was too narrow. The ears were wrong. Everything about it was wrong. This guy wanted me to verify that photo so he could sell it as Doc Adams. And he wasn't going to get that from me because it was crap.
Yeah.
And it just made me so angry
Yeah.
that people, want to make a buck. I don't mind somebody making a buck on the real thing. I'm a good capitalist. But don't try to sell me pie patties and call it chocolate cake.
Right.
I was just livid. In 5 weeks I went through this. I saved the stereopticon. I downloaded on. He's back and forth with me. Well, look at this and look at that. And if you compare it with the daguerreotype, I said, then you got to assume.
Right.
And the way you look at the 1862 picture, now the 1862 picture, the one where they're all sitting down, that image of Doc, that picture was hanging at the bottom of our stairs when I was a little girl. That picture of Doc looks so much like my father.
Wow.
That when I was little, I couldn't quite understand that this man in the photograph had so much hair because my father never had any hair.
Wow.
He never had any hair. And Doc had this beautiful head of hair in 1862.
Yeah.
And it just, I didn't understand it.
Yeah.
That's Doc. I saw that 1859 picture 40 years ago in an old book on sports. It said Knickerbockers. I went, that's Doc Adams.
Cool.
I could tell just by the shape of the head. Because of the 1862 photograph, I said, that's Doc Adams. Isn't that cool? And I went on with my life.
Right.
So the 1862 is so much like if you want to know what my father looked like,
Cool.
you look at that photo. It's amazing, the resemblance.
Yeah. On March 26th, 1862, Doc sent a letter to the club resigning as president of the Knickerbockers. He was 47 years old. You kind of brought this up earlier, but you think he didn't retire because of his age. It was because he had just recently found out that his wife was pregnant.
Yes.
Let's talk about that, because Doc and Cornelia had a miscarriage about 6 weeks after his resignation. And although Cornelia successfully gave birth to a child a couple years later, that child also passed away a month after its birth. So they were intent on starting a family, so that's why they moved out of New York.
It was for her health. On the recording that my grandfather made 8 months before he died, he said they moved because it was for his mother's health.
And what was the correlation in his mind there? They thought something
the
with the
city
altitude?
Yes, that was, which I think is interesting. Ridgefield, Connecticut is probably about 4 feet above sea level, but that's okay. Well, maybe 30. So they moved there late in 1865, and their first surviving child was born the following year. That's my great-aunt Catherine, who I knew.
Wow.
I knew as a little girl.
Wow.
Sweet old lady.
Yeah. While he lived in Ridgefield, Doc became one of the founding members of the Ridgefield Library, as well as its first treasurer. He was active with the Land Improvement Association, and in 1870 he served one term in the Connecticut State Legislature.
Yeah.
In 1871, Doc became the first president of the Ridgefield Savings Bank, and he would serve as president for 10 of the next 15 years. So it's so interesting to me that somebody could have this successful life, be such an important citizen in a new town, and then be like, yeah, when I lived in New York, I pretty much invented the game of baseball. But that was like 20 years ago. I don't really talk about that anymore.
Never talked about it.
That's so wild to me. Did he think of his life in different stages?
I guess he compartmentalized it.
Yeah.
I don't know. I really don't. I do know that he would play backyard baseball with his 2 sons.
Right.
He made the balls for them. And in this same recording that my grandfather made, he talks about how Doc used to soak the baseballs in a bucket of water to shrink the leather and make the ball harder.
Cool.
I don't think he made the bats. I'm sure they bought those. So he still loved the game. And in the same recording, my grandfather says how he would impress the boys with his batting. So he was still pretty good even into his 70s.
Right.
Playing the game, which I think is great.
That's amazing.
But baseball was just a diversion. It was for health. It was for exercise. It was a men's club. And I also think he might have had some health issues. And people have said, he retired for his health. I don't think that's the primary reason. He had had typhoid in 1851, but there really are no other references to his health in the family letters. So his health was well enough. He fathered 4 children between 1866 and 1874. He wasn't that decrepit.
Late in life, too.
And late in life.
Right, yeah.
And still played some baseball into his 70s.
Right.
So I think that's exaggerated.
Yeah, interesting.
I think that's exaggerated.
You mentioned the recordings. Your grandfather was Roger Cook Adams.
Yes.
And he said Doc's, quote, interest in baseball continued to the end of his life. Even after he was 75, he would occasionally join his sons in a neighborhood scrub game and astonish the boys with his hitting. Doc passed away on January 3rd, 1899. He was 84 years old. What do you think Doc's legacy currently is, and what do you think it should be?
Never been asked that before. I've never even had to think about it. His legacy is that he was one of the people who gave this country our national pastime. I think that's an important legacy.
Yeah.
He gave the world my grandfather, who I adored, who was just a heck of a nice guy. Wonderful man, sweetheart. So that's his other legacy.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I will leave that to the historians and everybody else.
Very diplomatic of you.
Thank you.
You met John Thorne for the first time in 2012. What has John Thorne's relationship meant to you and to your effort to get Doc inducted into the Hall of Fame?
90% of what I know about Doc Adams, I know because of John Thorne. Plain and simple. He's been very kind, very generous in sharing and in answering just the dumbest questions he's ever gotten from anybody. particularly 9-10 years ago when this was just starting for me. I don't ask him as many questions now. I still have them, God knows. I just don't want to appear that stupid after all this time that I'm still asking such dumb questions. But really, I would not know as much as I know about Doc if it weren't for John Thorne, first and foremost.
Yeah.
And he's been very kind and very generous with his knowledge.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And what an honor it is to have had his help and so forth. I'm just very blessed. Thank you, John.
Yeah, absolutely. In January of 2016, you got an email. Tell me about that email and what happened after you read it.
It was from Bill Reisick, who's a wonderful baseball historian and a friend. And he said, I know you don't like to open emails from people you don't know, but you're going to get an email from this person. You will want to open it. Oh, goodness gracious, like Christmas. And a few minutes later, I did. And it was from someone who said, I have something very interesting that I want an opportunity to show you. And I have signed a confidentiality agreement, so there's much I cannot say. I did have to travel to go meet with this man, and I walked into a conference room, and there spread out on the conference table, it still almost makes me cry, there were 14 pieces of paper. And the first 3 I recognized as Doc's handwriting. And I said, what is this? And he said, well, these are Doc Adams's rules of baseball. Even now, it's the fact that I was holding them. No, I didn't get any tear stains on them, but that's because I turned my head away. And I was so stunned. It was like sort of finding, gee, I'm going through an old box in the attic, and here I've got a signed copy of the Declaration of Independence. This is kind of cool. It was kind of like the same reaction.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I said, what am I looking, what is this? How did you tell me? He had bought these laws of baseball in 1998 at a Sotheby's auction. They were part of a set of other papers that were his primary interest. And they said, and there's some baseball things in there. He said, okay, well, I like baseball. Scoop it all up. He paid about $12,998 for this group of papers. He looked at the laws of baseball and stuck them in a drawer. Oh, God. Didn't do anything with them until mid-2015 when he got them out of the drawer and said, well, I ought to do something about them, find out what these are all about. And he did. He got them authenticated. Could have asked me. I've got lots of examples of Doc's handwriting, all locked up, thank you very much, in an undisclosed location. So anyway, I went to this man's conference room, and we sat for about an hour, and we pored over these papers. It was absolutely thrilling.
Yeah, I can't even imagine.
And you can't. I mean, for you, it would be like finding a whole box of letters written by Shoeless Joe Jackson that no one knew had existed.
Right.
All written in the 1920s.
Right.
So yes, that was absolutely thrilling. And this was about 6 weeks after Doc had been on the ballot for the Hall of Fame and had lost by 2 votes.
Right.
And I'm thinking to myself, what if this was a year ago? This would have improved his chances. And the man was very nice, as if he could read my mind. He said, yes, I wish I'd started this much earlier. He was very nice about it.
Yeah.
We're still friends, and we communicate occasionally, and we keep in touch. And as far as I'm concerned, the confidentiality agreement is still in effect. And he gave me full-size copies of the laws of baseball, all ready for me.
Amazing.
To take with me. He said, now, you have to sign the confidentiality. I said, fine. I said, can I tell my sister? Please let me tell my sister. I got to tell somebody. He said, yes, you can tell your sister. I said, good, okay, I'll tell her, which I did.
So do you have the copies that he gave you? Are
Of
those
course.
displayed somewhere?
I mean, they're out there now. They've been displayed. Some of the pages have been displayed at the Library of Congress, which I went to see 2 years ago.
How thrilling
That
was
was kind of cool.
Yeah.
That was really cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was fun.
You said, though, when you walked into that room with the conference tables that there were 14 pieces of paper sprawled out.
Yeah, I think it was about 14 pages.
What were the other pages?
They were the copy made by Grinnell.
Oh, okay.
And Grinnell's laws. So they were all there as well.
Cool.
I mean, they were all spread out, and I'm going, it was like food for the starving. I mean, it was so exciting.
Yeah.
It was so exciting.
Yeah, so the missing fourth page,
It's gone forever.
but we still know what those rules were
Yes,
because of the Grinnell.
Because he copied them over verbatim.
Yeah.
That's how we know exactly what Doc was thinking, because everything else that he copied was verbatim from Doc's laws.
Perfect. Yeah, that's awesome.
I've got to tell you a funny story, though. When I was at the Library of Congress, and I was with a friend of mine. In fact, my friend is Roger Ratzenberger, who does our website.
Right.
And thank you, Roger. It's the most beautiful website in the world, and I torture him regularly about it. He and his wife, Kathy, and I, we were all right there, and we're standing right by the display where Doc's Laws is. And a guide comes by with a whole group of tourists. She starts lecturing about Doc. And Roger said, I should just push you forward. Have you tell them about Doc. I said, oh, please don't, please don't. But it was kind of weird hearing the guide at the Library of Congress talk about Doc Adams.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, well, I've got all my Doc Adams cards, baseball cards in my pocket with the website. Maybe I can just hand them out to people. Here, vote for Doc, vote for Doc. Please sign our petition on our website. I didn't, but it was awfully close.
Yeah. What a surreal experience that must have been.
Yeah.
Are there any pieces of memorabilia that you have or that your family still has, whether they're baseball related or not? Just anything from Doc? You've mentioned those letters, but are there other things?
Oh, yes.
What kind of stuff?
These are also locked up in a bank vault. We have 2 buttons that belong to Doc that are embossed with KBBC on them.
Yes.
That they're a little bit larger than a quarter, and they're studs. They are not regular sew-on buttons. And I showed very detailed pictures of them to Jim Gates at the Hall of Fame at the library. He's one of the head researchers there. I think he's just retired, however. Awfully nice man. He and I talked about the buttons. He said they were probably ceremonial for special occasions. And he said they're similar to the sort of stud buttons that would go into a collar of a band uniform or a military uniform. So we do have those. And yes, they are locked up because now that the Laws of Baseball sold in April of 2016 for $3.26 million, at the time the third highest paid for any sports memorabilia. Mm-hmm. I think it's been eclipsed by another Babe Ruth uniform. How many uniforms did that man have? But anyway,
seemingly endless amount.
Seemingly endless. I mean, I should have this wardrobe as big. But it's still the highest paid for any baseball document. Mm-hmm. And that was in 2016, $3.26 million.
That's a pretty decent return on an investment that was less than $13,000.
Yes, pretty decent.
20 years earlier.
Yeah, just for something you stuck in a drawer. I have also been in touch with the new owner of the Laws.
Good. I was going to ask you about that. I'm glad to know that. But back to him stuffing it in the drawer. Yes. It's almost better that he did that because that means that for 20 years it wasn't subjected to sunlight. It was protected and
it was just
preserved.
Growing in value.
Right.
But if only he'd brought it out the year before, mm-hmm. That's and I know he regrets it as well. He kept apologizing.
There are some relatives of legendary players who are kind of slimy when it comes to the way that they exploit their relation to their famous ancestor. Some people have made it essentially a career, but that doesn't seem at all to be what you're trying to do. How would you describe the mission that you've been on for these last 10 years?
I love American history. I love baseball history. I just think that if Cooperstown is going to be the representative of the history of the game, Doc Adams should be there. That's all I want. This is for my father and for my grandfather. They are looking down at me from heaven, and they are saying, keep going. As my father used to say to me as a child with my terrible schoolwork, he would say, Marjorie, just get in there and pitch. Keep pitching, keep pitching. So I'm going to keep pitching for Doc and for my father and grandfather. And after that, I can't wait to walk away from it. I'm retired, and I have a lot of books, about 30 books at home that have nothing to do with baseball that I'm just dying to read. Mm-hmm. But I get diverted. I read some of them, of course. I've just read a wonderful book on Lincoln, a new Lincoln book. But I have other things I want to do.
Yeah.
So I will be very glad to walk away. We don't make a dime on any of this.
Right.
I don't seek it. I don't want it. Sometimes people ask me for my autograph. I think that's absurd. Anybody would want me to sign anything. I can't imagine why. So, no, this is not my life. It is right now. Mm-hmm. But no, when this is over, this is over.
Mm-hmm. We mentioned Doc's appearance on the Hall of Fame ballot in 2015, but just to give the specifics. So that was his first time on the ballot. He received 10 of the 16 possible votes, and while he was the top vote getter of the pre-integration era ballot that year, he needed 12 votes to be elected. So why is it important for you that Doc be recognized and enshrined in Cooperstown? How do you think that would change the narrative of what we've all been taught for all
Well,
these
there are a
years?
lot of narratives up at Cooperstown that are wrong.
Right.
I won't get into all the details. People are free to do their own research.
Mm-hmm.
I just want the history of Cooperstown to be as correct as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, there's a big gap
Right.
and a big error, and I won't go any further with it. And I just feel very strongly that history is a fact.
Mm-hmm.
History isn't a fiction or a fantasy. Sometimes it takes a while to prove it, but history is still a fact.
Yeah.
Tomorrow's the fantasy and the fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Yesterday is the real deal.
Interesting. I like the way you put that.
Oh, thank you.
What is the biggest challenge that you faced in your efforts to get this to happen?
Getting to people who really might be able to make a difference. Real sports writers, columnists, journalists, anyone who, when there isn't much to write about baseball these days, I mean, we're now at the playoffs, but it's obviously been a weird season.
Yes.
And pretty soon it's going to be off season.
Right.
And if someone's interested in, filling a few columns, a few inches of column space, I'd love to hear from some of these people.
Mm-hmm.
I really would. I want to get the word out there as best I can, and it is an uphill climb. I'm on a lot of Facebook pages who very kindly let me post whatever I want about Doc,
Mm-hmm.
and I do, viciously, frequently.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. It's not hurting, but how much is it helping? I don't know.
But like we said earlier, all it takes is that one person.
Yes.
You have to explore all these avenues because you never know if you're reaching out to that one person
Absolutely.
or if the one person that reads your thing knows the one person who needs to see it. So
That's why I'm sitting here talking to you.
yeah, it's sometimes it seems exhausting.
Besides,
to
your
do
name's
this.
Daniel. I had to. I absolutely had to. It was karma.
It does feel like that.
It was
doesn't
karma.
I'm going to give you two scenarios, and I want you to tell me how you would react and how your life would change given each of the two different outcomes. So first, the early baseball committee era votes and Doc Adams is elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. What happens moving forward for you after that?
Gee, I'm not a drinker, but there might be a bottle of Prosecco in my future that day. And I don't drink. I had a little wine July of last year. I had half a glass. But I don't drink.
Mm-hmm.
But very definitely there will be some nice chilled Prosecco involved. After that, I'm going to clean out my doc office. I'm giving away the books. I'm going to throw out a lot of files I don't need anymore. I'll keep the good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot of baseball friends who would like some of these books and things, and they're gone.
Mm-hmm.
I'm downsizing.
Yeah.
And I have so many books. Oh, my. Yeah. Anyway, no, it's great. It's a lot of fun. Don't get me wrong, but I got a whole room to clean out.
Something can be simultaneously fun and extremely exhausting and
Yes.
draining. And yeah, I mean, I totally understand that. Okay, but what about if they hold the vote and he falls short?
I'm done. Because if they don't recognize why he should be in the Hall of Fame, what the heck are they all sitting around for anyway? And the next vote will be in 2030. You've met me now. You know I'm not a young woman. In all likelihood, I will not be here for that. I am not spending the next 10 years of my life, or not by then 9 years, because they've postponed the vote till next year.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not spending another 9 years doing this. It's not that I'm a quitter, but if I haven't made the case by now, I never will.
Right. What more can you say or
What
do?
more can I say? What more can I do?
Yeah.
I mean, barring somebody finding something in their attic, Doc's diary of why I played baseball,
Right.
barring that, there's nothing for me more to say or do except what I've already said or done.
Yeah. What can people do to help make sure that the first scenario is the one that plays out, where Doc ends up being enshrined in Cooperstown?
Well, certainly sign our petition,
Mm-hmm.
docadamsbaseball.org. It's absolutely secure and private, very safe. We don't sell any of the names. And if they know someone who's a writer, a baseball writer or a sports writer, talk to them about Doc Adams. They can get in touch with me through the website if they want to do an article on Doc, or another podcast, or just a conversation over the phone if they want to write about Doc. Just whatever we can get out there, whatever it takes. There was a lot of good press when The Laws of Baseball sold for 2.6. I mean, it was in Sports Illustrated, the AP did it, and then it spread everywhere. And CNN, I think, did 2 seconds on it. Of course, ESPN covered it. John Thorne was interviewed along with Jim Catt on some MLB program, and it came up, and that was great. It was great. That's why, one of the reasons John was there that evening was to talk about it. So the more Doc is talked about, the more those voters next year, whoever they are, and there's always several members of the BBWAA and several executive/team owners and one historian that make up the committee. So the more of these people who know that name, the historian will, whoever the baseball historian will know the name. And so long as whoever puts together the bio for Doc that they will be given in a binder, and so long as they read it, then we've got a shot. Everything I do is bred upon the waters. It's bred upon the waters. The more people who know the name, the better chance I've got.
How can people reach out to you if they can offer some help, or if they just want to learn more about Doc Adams and get the word out there?
We have a wonderful website, thanks to my friend Roger Ratzenberger. It's www.docadamsbaseball.org, and they can reach me through there as well.
Great. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you would have liked to have gotten to?
Probably not. And if there was, I'll think of it at 3 o'clock this morning.
Same.
So I'll call you, right?
Me too, yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. This was incredible.
No. Thank you, Dan.
Honor to talk to you.
Really, this has been a great pleasure, and I thank you so much for letting me talk about Doc.
Thank you.
It was great. Thank you.
I appreciate it. And now it's time for a segment called What'd You Think, Mom?, where we talk to my mom, who just listened to the interview with me, and we ask her what she thinks. This is my real, actual mom. Her name is Lori, but I've always just called her Mom. Can you say something to prove that you are my mom?
I was the first person to call you Daniel, and I really enjoyed when she called you Daniel.
All right.
Not too many people are going to say that.
So what did you think of the Marjorie Adams interview and the whole experience? This was your first time being there for an interview. So what did you think of that?
That's what I was going to say. I was a little concerned about being present because it's kind of our ritual that we listen to the interview together and go through it, and I just absorb it, and then we talk right away. And I was concerned about whether that would throw off our rhythm and the way we've done things so far. It was such a blessing to be there with you, though. This was the one. As soon as we met Marjorie and she started talking, she had me. I felt she was a kindred spirit. A lot of things that are her passions are my passions. She had me at American history. Don't even have to go further than that.
All right. Well, thanks for coming.
No, it was a great experience.
Yeah. And just how welcoming she was, and, just made it more than just the interview, and, was there to talk to us and tell us about where we met her and the history of her town and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, she was a real fun person to be around, more than just the interview itself.
Absolutely. And the passion that she brought that day, it was contagious. You just felt like you immediately understood where she was at and why she was doing what she was doing, and wanted to support her efforts because they should be supported. To me, I think this is one of the most important interviews you've ever done, because without the topics that we were talking about with Marjorie, what her mission is, we wouldn't be here today. Everything that comes after had to come through this. So in trying to do a little bit of research before we went and finding out, first of all, just the discussions of the myth of Abner Doubleday, it's like, really? Come on. As a historian, I know things aren't always the way they seem to be, and it is only up to whoever's reporting it or writing about something.
Or whoever's paying for the plaque at the site.
And that doesn't mean anything. In this case, it's so far away from reality. That's got to be so frustrating. So in doing some of the research, the other side of looking at how baseball really got its start and doing some research into Elysian Fields, and then being lucky enough to stop there on the way to seeing her, just being in that space in Hoboken, it just was so against any preconceptions I had about how baseball got its start, that these players that we're talking about, Doc Adams being one, they were lawyers, doctors, stockbrokers, accountants, men who were working in the offices of early Manhattan looking for exercise and relaxation after their job in the office. And so they're coming in their suits or their vests and going to play baseball and not changing into a uniform.
Yeah.
That was a little mind-bending for me. I just never thought about it that way, about Doc Adams in particular. And Marjorie, having your family history, kind of being aware of it, but not really being aware of it because, as she said, they're Puritans, Yankees. They don't boast, they don't self-promote, and it just wasn't a big part of it. It might have been a little bit, but it's not until she's an adult that she really is learning more and more about it and finding out he's one of the fathers of baseball.
When you said that this is an important interview, I completely agree, and I kind of tried to bring that up in the interview with Marjorie to be like, without Doc, we might not have baseball. And since Marjorie's so humble, she kind of brushed it off as like, oh no, somebody would have come along. And it's like, no, it's not like it's the Mississippi River.
Right.
And eventually, yeah, somebody would have found it.
Right.
You never know. If his passion waned a little bit and he stopped making the baseballs, or he stopped overseeing the production of the bats, and he stopped trying to get his players to come to these games, that's how stuff dies. It's not like somebody else would have just eventually come along and been like, yeah, you know what? I'll take up the charge. It doesn't always work that way.
Right. What if it was some slacker who was nominated and elected as president?
Right.
It just goes by the wayside.
Right.
It definitely is about him. He has a critical part. And thankfully, they did keep records. And so we can know every little detail, including when they took a drubbing, as she said. It was interesting to see, like, she knows the date of the first game. I mean, this is so typical of a baseball historian, not her being typical of a baseball historian. I'm just saying how every single detail of baseball is kept track of. You know, she's looking up the stats for his first game, and she goes, oh, here it is. And it's a game from 1845. And I love the little detail about, you know, the games are called because of dark, you know. And when she said that about that particular game, I was thinking it was mid-November in New York.
Right. That was my first thing.
When did they get off work, and how many hours of daylight did they have? Because they had to travel to the fields.
Forget the darkness. It must have been 20 degrees.
It could have been.
It's late.
Yeah.
What would she say? November 18th, I think?
Right.
In New York.
That seemed an odd time to have your first game be at that point in the season.
Yeah. It was immediately after that game where they decided, let's wait till spring. Let's call it spring training.
Also, during that part of the conversation, she described how they first started playing at Madison Square Park. And then when they got bumped out of there because Manhattan kept growing, then they ended up going up to Harlem, and they would have to take the trolley up to 86th and Park Avenue, which was where she grew up. And when she reads that, again, as an adult, and thinking all the time that she's walking around there as a little kid and going about her day, not realizing her great-grandfather was right around there, living part of his life there too. And that just is a little mind-blowing. I've had an experience like that myself with my great-grandparents being someplace where I thought I discovered this place, and I took my parents to it because it was such a cool place. And then a few years later, my mom pulls out the scrapbook, and there's photographs of my great-grandparents there. And I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, well, whatever.
You discovered the Mississippi River and found out, oh, somebody else had gone over there before.
That's it. But she had the experience of walking in her great-grandfather's footsteps, and that must have been very cool. For me, that would have been very cool. I'm a family historian and love that kind of thing. I love her passion in trying to educate people about Doc Adams and not that Doc Adams. My first thing was I wanted to say, even though I grew up in the era of Gunsmoke, I've never seen Gunsmoke. And so I never knew there was another Doc Adams until her Doc Adams. So when you talked about what were his roles that he needed to accomplish as president of the baseball club, that he was in charge of attendance. No, not of fans, but of the players.
I feel his pain on that. I mean, trying to get people together for the vintage games that we play.
Right.
And it's like, he didn't even have email back then. So how was he? It must have been a real struggle for him to hound these people and be like, listen, the game's on Thursday. Are you coming or are you not? Do I need to bring an extra orange slice? My mom has been asking me for weeks, what flavor Capri Sun do you want?
Yeah, I wonder how that went.
Not great, which is why it took them 5 years before they played their second game.
Well, building on what they were talking about then and plugging or soaking a runner, I just want to put my vote in that we don't change what year rules we play for the vintage games. Go back further to where plugging and soaking was allowed, because that's going to be ugly. Can you imagine?
Yeah, that's how we used to play as little kids. Obviously with the tennis ball, but at a certain point, like Marjorie said, a kid can start throwing pretty hard.
Right.
Then it's like, okay, we can't play this way anymore.
Right. She talked about how Doc's math genius contributed to his contributions to the game. And baseball has always been a game of numbers. And now we know it really has been always a game of numbers. And now I want to go look up, what is the deal with nines? You know, what is it about that number? What significance does that number have? It's just too many times of it being there. Or was it the symmetry of it? Or was it the beauty of the nines?
Yeah, and when uniforms became a thing, the really nice ones, people were dressed to the nines.
Oh, nice. You're here all week, right?
Most of the week, yeah.
It was great to see her passion turned into frustration when she talked about the 1846 daguerreotype. She knows what Doc looks like. She studied Doc a time or two.
Right.
She grew up in a house where his painting's hanging at the bottom of her stairs, and she sees it every single day. And you have somebody who isn't related to him arguing with her to prove a point or whatever.
Well, he had an ulterior motive. We run into that at the museum too. People emailing or bringing artifacts in and saying, hey, this is a game-used bat. No, it's not. It was made in 1947.
Right.
Same thing with the photographs. Isn't this Joe in this picture? No, it's not. I'm sorry. Like, it looks like him a little bit, but it's not him, because we know that in June of 1923, he was in Georgia, and this photo is in Minnesota.
Right.
And, you know, just stuff like that. It's like, you know who's trying to pull one over on you.
Right.
And usually it's for their own financial benefit.
Back to the photograph of Doc being on the wall at the bottom of the stairs and her little girl mind trying to wrap her head around, at what point in my life did my dad have hair? Because, you know.
Right. That's how similar they looked.
That's how similar they looked. Yeah. And, you know, so many things we talk about with people during the podcast are things that you could bring to your own life. A photograph of my great-grandfather from 1908 standing along a tavern bar. He's one of 12 men. I can pick him out every time because I have a cousin who looks just like him. And that happens. And more to her point about it's not Doc in the 1846 daguerreotype. When she talks about his legacy, she said he was one of the people who gave the country its national pastime. It's pretty cool to be able to make that statement about someone in your family, someone you love through your familial connection.
Yeah. Marjorie was quick to point out that it wasn't just Doc. He didn't create baseball, and even Grinnell helped write the rules and transcribe them, and if it weren't for his copy of Doc's rules, we wouldn't know what all the rules were because one of the pages is missing.
Right.
So Marjorie was very complimentary of all of the people who were involved, and it is kind of a shame that the other players and other members of the baseball clubs have kind of been lost to history, but that's how much cooler it is that we do know who Doc Adams was, and that we have these documents, we have these records, we have these box scores, the newspapers that talked about the games after the fact. Those things, it's been 150 years, 170 years. It's cool that we can look back and really trace the roots of the sport.
When you talk about how long ago it's been, and when she made the comment that he's at Yale and he's doing flute duets with Henry Ward Beecher.
In 1832.
Right. So put it to a parallel of what you know about American history and what's going on at that time. And that's his contemporaries. Right. I mean, he was born more than 200 years ago. We know everything about him. We know what day he sent a letter to resign from his position as the president. And that's a little mind-blowing, I guess. Her experience of going to see the pages for the very first time and just having that gift of that experience being given to her so unexpectedly in 2016, getting the heads up email to be ready. Marjorie,
Hey, actually read this one.
yeah. This one's going to rock the rest of your world. Just make sure you don't let it go into the spam folder. And so then she walks into a room and she sees 14 pages spread out on a table and leans over and sees Doc's handwriting. And the hair on the back of my neck went up when she just told the story. I can only imagine how she felt, but I could hear how she felt because you hear it in her voice, and the emotion is still there. It must have been a moment of vindication, not angry vindication or vindictive vindication, just peace of spirit of knowing you've been fighting this fight to get someone recognized for their accomplishments and for their contributions, and the proof is in the pages in front of you.
Yeah, one of the reasons I like doing the podcast in this format with the long form interviews is that you have the chance to get those moments. If this were just a 10-minute interview, we would have never gotten there.
Right.
Or we might have gotten to the story, but we wouldn't have had that same emotion. We wouldn't have had that moment. And we've had those moments in a handful of the interviews where people are close to breaking down or just get super emotional about whatever we're talking about. And to me, those are the moments that make a podcast like this worth listening to.
Absolutely. It was very touching, but again, it makes it personal because it is personal. At least in this particular case, you have someone who is a descendant waging this battle for rightful recognition. It's a no-brainer to me, as opposed to someone else who is just a historian trying to get something recognized.
But that's, again, the reason why I called this podcast My Baseball History. It's about Marjorie's personal history with baseball. And every interview that we do, every episode, it's about that person's baseball history. And yeah, we try to weave in the actual history of baseball into that story, however it fits. But the interviews are about the people, and that's what makes the game great and why here we are 170 years later still playing this bat and ball game.
Right. So after she has the opportunity to see these pages in person and touch them, and I'm sure that was a thrill too, just to handle. Though it sounds like she and her family have amazing
archives and documents, and
not only from Doc, but just family letters from the 1800s. I mean, you know, how many families in America can really say that? We're a country of immigrants. But then follow that through to when the pages were on display at the Library of Congress, and she's lucky enough to go there and experience that. And for someone who is an American history fan as she is, and a reader as she is, just to be in that sacred space and then see these pages there. And then throw in having a tour guide, not knowing who she is, bring over a tour group and go through the Doc Adams spiel. And she's going in her head, yeah, no, well, all right, we'll let that one slide kind of thing. But that must have been a surreal moment.
Yeah, I've asked some people that type of question when I've talked to them, whether it's about sports or music or whoever. When you have a famous family member, what is it like to have somebody else who you've never met know more about your family member than you do and educate you about, like, oh no, when he was 17, what was really happening? It's like, how do you know this?
Yeah.
It's got to be kind of weird. I'm sure it's flattering and it feels cool that people care, but that has to be a weird feeling. If somebody came up to you and was like, I'm going to tell you what your grandfather was doing when he was 19 years old with date documentation accuracy, how would you even react to that?
I guess if it was in that situation, I would be like she was when she read Baseball in the Garden of Eden, where I'd be soaking up every little morsel of information you could give me because I'd want to know more about my great-grandfather, my grandfather. There are still things I'm learning about my grandparents that I just soak up because it's going to be gone soon. But yeah, in this situation where you'd be someplace like that, where it's a little bit different than somebody on the street, you're now in the Library of Congress and they're talking about them. And another aspect of Doc that she came to find out, probably more through family history and family letters, but then also melding the family history on the personal level with the research and documents that other people have found that she is now aware of in putting together what was going on in his personal life. For example, when he does retire from baseball or when he writes his Yale alumni bio. And in that bio, he doesn't even mention baseball.
Right.
But the comment that he does make is that marrying his wife was the crowning achievement of his life. And that just speaks to the man he was. And when he retires and steps back, it's because his wife is pregnant with their first child. And so he gives up one passion for the true passion. Again, speaks to the person and what his priorities were, rightfully so. And I love that he's playing baseball into his 70s and still making baseballs for his sons and their buddies.
And after he retired, the Knickerbocker Baseball Club tried to get him back. They sent him letters saying like, hey, we've got a game next. Seriously. They were like, you're going to be there, right? And one of them, he did show up. They had basically an old timers game. So he did show up and participate. But that just shows that his teammates were like, hey, man, we kind of like having you around here, too. You know, you brought something to the table more than just an extra body.
Right. I don't know that I ever thought about how did the position of shortstop come up? Oh, it came up because he figured out you needed someone there. You needed the intermediate spot to be filled, and it needed to be able to float around. And he's the guy who put that together and perfected the spot. How the heck is he not? In his Sporting News interview, he talked about the position of shortstop and how he created it and whatever, and just the mind of it, of figuring that out and figuring out how many feet should be between the bases and how it needs to be uniform. And well, of course it has to be uniform, because how are your stats comparable otherwise? You're apples to oranges. You can't do that. You know, that just flies against math.
Yeah.
The line about the distance from home plate to first base being
as close to perfect as man's ever gotten.
There's your baseball geek right there.
But current baseball players and teams are doing the same thing. And I don't think anybody's going to create a new position anytime soon, but they're definitely creating new positionings. And not to say that baseball hasn't done shifts. That's been going on for 100 years too. But people are standing in unorthodox spots because they know, like, okay, this guy normally hits the ball over here, so why would we put somebody on the other side of the field? He never hits it there, or he hits it there 12% of the time.
Right.
So I'll bet on the 88%.
Right.
And you other teams, you can stand in the 12% spot, but I want to be better positioned, so if he hits it where I think he's going to hit it, I'm ready to get him out. And that's what Doc did 170 years ago.
Right.
He's like, I need to be out there so I can throw it when somebody hits it out there.
Right.
I'm just going to stand out there.
He did the math.
Right. And nobody was like, we stand by the bases. He's just like, well, I stand out here now.
It was interesting that they possibly would do that between first and second.
But then it went back to the percentages where most guys...
Against the math.
Yeah, most guys were right-handed, so they're going to hit it to the left side.
Okay, this is maybe a dumb baseball question, but does the shortstop have to stay between second and third? Like, could they shift over to between first and second?
He could stand and have his hand on the right field foul pole if he wanted to. Anybody can stand wherever they want. It's just the percentages say this is where we need somebody because that ground needs to be covered. But you'll see in late game situations, especially in the playoffs or something, a team might bring in either their right fielder or left fielder and make a fifth infielder and have two guys play like, okay, you're playing right center field and you're playing left center field because if a ball goes to the outfield, we're going to lose anyways. So let's cover the infield. And so, yeah, you can stand wherever you want. Or the opposite happens where they'll completely remove the left side of the infield. Like the third baseman is playing basically behind second base.
Right.
And the shortstop is playing where the second baseman would, and the second baseman's playing short right field. Again, it's just, where do we think this guy's going to hit the ball? Let's put our defenders in that position. You don't have to stand anywhere. You have to be in fair territory.
I've definitely seen the shift. I've definitely seen where you might have whoever is coming in a little bit closer to play a short outfield or a long infield, depending on your perspective. But I don't know that I've seen a third baseman come off and drift over to second. But whatever, that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, that's kind of what some people ask. If a defense does go into that dramatic of a shift where the entire side of a field is open, why isn't the batter just laying down a bunt and it's a guaranteed hit? All you have to do is keep it in fair territory. Nobody can get to that baseball. So it's a guaranteed hit. Why aren't they doing that? And the argument is, well, we're not paying him to bunt the baseball. And when you see the movie Moneyball with Billy Beane coming up with his new theory that changed the sport 20 years ago, he said, no, we're paying you to get on base. So whether that's a single or a home run or a walk, get on base. We're paying you to not make outs.
Correct.
So I don't care if you hit the ball 280 feet. If they catch it at the end, it was a waste of an at-bat. Get on base. And some teams think that way and some teams don't.
Right. Well, and that's why he ended up.
Right. That's why his team with a $38 million payroll won 103 games.
Math wins. Math wins.
And saved his job.
Yeah. In talking about Cooperstown, this is another myth that's broken by the conversation and just other things we've learned about in recent years. And there's a difference between having facts be discovered versus something going in and knowing that was incorrect. But for Doc Adams to have his story documented, have his contribution documented, as I said before, I think it's a no-brainer. And I think Marjorie's comment about there are a lot of things that aren't accurate. There are a lot of things wrong in Cooperstown, starting with Abner Doubleday. But I guess it's another myth buster for me, just having to think about sometimes there's politics involved, or a lot of times there's politics involved. And that's not even taking into consideration the steroid era versus, some of the things that have been going on. But it should be based on fact, not fiction. That was a comment that she made, and I think that is absolutely true. When you have a museum or you have a repository that is supposed to be the collector of all pertinent things baseball, that should be the go-to source. And the best knowledge at any given point should be available from that source. That's how we feel about the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum. That's how any museum feels or should feel. So I'm excited for the vote to happen and have Doc Adams get in there and Marjorie to be able to have the hair on the back of her neck stand up when she hears his name called and she unveils that plaque.
And drinks her Prosecco.
Another thing we have in common. I'm right there with you, Marjorie. I want to pop that bottle with you. I'm excited to spread the word for her, not only through the podcast, and I'm sure there'll be other ways that you'll spread the word too. Go to the website. The main thing is sign the petition. Do some reading up on Elysian Fields and find out what the true start of baseball was if you don't already know it. Marjorie referenced a couple books that kind of shed light on the story, and there are more and more things being written because now that the first can of worms was opened up, so to speak, now people are digging and the research is out there to be found and people are finding it. Now they know where to direct the hunt.
Yeah, one of the newer books that came out is one that Marjorie talks about, How Baseball Happened by Tom Gilbert. So that's one that is a real good resource if you want to learn about the origin story of the game and where things started.
I guess we may have a date in Cooperstown. That would be nice to be out there when that happens.
Thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for taking me with you.
Okay, so that's it. In the introduction of this episode, I mentioned a trivia question you can answer to win something. Here's how you can do that. First, make sure you're following us on Twitter at Shoeless Podcast. Then find the pinned tweet at the top of our profile with the link to the Marjorie Adams episode, which asks this episode's trivia question. The answer to the trivia question was somewhere in this episode you just finished listening to. Retweet that tweet along with your answer, and we'll announce the winner on the next episode. You don't have to be first, you just have to be right. And you've got to be following us. We'll pick one person who answered correctly, and they'll win an enamel pin only available to members of the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum, and a replica of a vintage lemon peel baseball, just like the ones Doc used to make for the Knickerbocker Baseball Club. But it's more than just a ball you'll be getting. This ball has been autographed by Marjorie. During our interview, we mentioned a couple of the rules from the Laws of Baseball which Doc wrote in 1857 that we would still recognize today. If you're following along with the liner notes online, you've already seen the link to the full list, so I won't read all 35 rules for you guys here, but I did want to touch on a few of the ones that really stand out to me. It's super interesting to go back and read the rules the way they were originally written. We take the rules for granted because we've all been watching or playing baseball for so long, but to think that at one point, these rules didn't exist, and somebody had to physically sit there and write them out so everyone was playing the same game, that's cool to me. And remember, these were written more than 160 years ago. Rule 6 tells us what a balk is. The ball must be pitched, not jerked or thrown to the bat, and whenever the pitcher draws back his hand with the apparent purpose or pretension to deliver the ball, he shall so deliver it. The pitcher must deliver the ball as near as possible over the center of the home base, and must have neither foot in advance of the line at the time of delivering the ball, and if he fails in either of these particulars, then it shall be declared a balk. So basically that's saying, Once a pitcher starts his motion, he has to throw the pitch. And while there wasn't a pitching rubber back then, that phrasing about having neither foot in advance of the line at the time of delivering the ball is talking about exactly that. So that was Rule 6, which tells us what a balk is, and then Rule 7 gives the consequence for a balk. When a balk is made by the pitcher, every player running the bases is entitled to one base without being put out. Rule 17 dictates where a batter can stand and tells us that a specific batting order must be followed, as well as determining who leads off any inning after the first inning. Players must stand on a line drawn through the center of the home base, not exceeding in length 3 feet from either side thereof, and such line shall be parallel with the line occupied by the pitcher. They shall strike in regular rotation, and after the first inning is played, the turn commences with the player who stands on the list next to the one who lost the third hand. So that's basically creating a batter's box, and then saying that whoever was next in the batting order after the guy who made the third out in the previous inning leads off the next inning. It seems so obvious to us now, but they had to write these down sometime, and this is how they chose to do it. Rule 19 talks about runners having to stay within a base path. Players running the bases must, so far as possible, keep upon the direct line between the bases, and should any player run 3 feet out of this line for the purpose of avoiding the ball in the hands of an adversary, he shall be declared out. Rule 20 outlines runners' interference. Any player who shall intentionally prevent an adversary from catching or fielding the ball shall be declared out. And if there should be runners' interference, then surely there should be defensive interference, so Rule 21 talks about that. If a player is prevented from making a base by the intentional obstruction of an adversary, he shall be entitled to that base and not be put out. I love the fact that they're calling their opponents adversaries here. I wish we would bring that back. Rule 24 says, if there are 2 outs, it doesn't matter when a runner crosses home plate if the batter is out on the play, because that run won't count. Which you just know was a specific situation they had argued about on the field previously, and somebody was like, "Put it on the list, Doc!" If 2 hands are already out, no player running home at the time a ball is struck can make an ace if the striker is put out. So another thing that's interesting to me reading through these rules, which I hope you go online and check out also, the different terms that they used back then compared to what we talk about today. If 2 hands are already out, if there's 2 outs, no player running home at the time a ball is struck can make an ace. So that means he can't score a run. You can't make an ace, you can't score a run. If the striker is put out, so the striker is the batter. If the batter is out at first, it doesn't matter if runners crossed home plate before that because the batter's out. Now, Rule 27 is an interesting one. Not only does it designate that there should be 9 players to a team, when up until this point teams could have had anywhere between 6 and 11 players, but this was the first time that revolving was outlawed, which basically says that ringers weren't allowed to jump from team to team, playing for whoever paid them the most on a given day. In playing all matches, 9 players from each club shall constitute a full field, and they must have been regular members of the club which they represent for 30 days prior to the match. No change or substitution shall be made after the game has been commenced, unless for reason of illness or injury. Positions of players shall be determined by captains, previously appointed for that purpose by their respective clubs. Could you imagine if that was still a rule today, that you had to be on a team for 30 days before you were allowed to play for them? I think there'd be a lot less in-season trades. Now, Rule 31 says a game has to be at least 5 innings for it to count as an official game. The umpires and referee in any match shall determine when play shall be suspended, and if the game cannot be concluded, it shall be decided by the last even innings, provided 5 innings have been played, and the party having the greatest number of runs shall be declared the winner. When it says it shall be decided by the last even innings, that doesn't mean it can only end after the 6th inning or the 8th inning. It just means any inning after the 5th in which both teams have had an even number of turns at bat. Rule 32 says that individual fields may have their own grounds rules as long as they're stated and consistent. Clubs may adopt such rules respecting balls knocked beyond or outside of the bounds of the field as the circumstances of the ground may demand, and these rules shall govern all matches played upon the ground, provided that they are distinctly made known to every player and umpire and the referee previous to the commencement of the game. And that's something that they still use today. The size of the infield and the distance to the bases and the distance to the pitcher's mound is consistent in every park. But the distances to the outfield wall are different in every park. The shape of the outfield wall, the size and the height of the outfield wall, the amount of ground in foul territory, all of these things can be different and are different in every park in Major League Baseball. For instance, you don't have to ever worry about a ball getting stuck in the ivy in Yankee Stadium, but when you're playing in Wrigley Field, you do. So they need specific ground rules for that have been laid out previous to the game, so everybody is on the same page when the game starts. Rule 34 says who is allowed to be an umpire. No person shall be permitted to act as an umpire or referee in a match unless he shall be a member of a baseball club governed by these rules. Speaking of being a member, if you'd like to become a member of our museum, we would be thrilled to have you. Just go to our website, shoelessjoejackson.org, and click the tab at the top that says Join. You can pick the annual membership that fits your current budget, and you'll get some cool stuff in return. It could range from items in our gift shop to a personally guided tour around Greenville where you can see all of the spots here in town that are important to Joe's life and career. Our museum is always free to enter, but your memberships, purchases, and donations allow us to continue to operate and continue to serve our community, both in person and online. If you have questions about the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum, about the podcast, or about anything else, you can reach out on social media or email me at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer them in the next episode. If you want to send in a video or audio recording of your questions so I can play it on the show, that's cool too. If you have ideas for guests you'd like us to talk to on the podcast, send us your list. As is evidenced by our interview guests for this episode, sometimes those suggestions actually work. And if you know current or former baseball players, managers, broadcasters, journalists, or if you are one, let's talk. A lot of you have liked and subscribed to My Baseball History, and we are so thankful for that. Some of you have even rated and reviewed the show. SR Says left a 5-star rating and said, Dan does a great job of doing in-depth interviews with people who represent a wide cross-section of the world of baseball. Anyone who's a fan of the game, especially its history, will enjoy listening. The discussions with his mom at the end add another level to this podcast. Thank you so much for those kind words and for understanding what we're going for here. It's a huge help when you guys rate and review the show on whatever platform you choose to listen on. 5-star ratings help our podcast get shown on more people's suggested podcast page, which means that more people will hear our show. They also help us get mentioned on lists like the one Player.fm recently put out, which named My Baseball History as one of the best baseball history podcasts of 2020. We wouldn't have been recognized on a list like that without your guys' support. It just takes a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us a lot. And of course, liking us on social media, interacting with our posts, and sharing things with your friends is great too. No matter how you choose to support us, even if it's just by listening, we appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is My Baseball History.